From giving fans their very first animated glimpse into the world of Middle-earth, to possibly having a bona fide anime legend direct the whole thing, here's everything you need to know about Lord of the Rings: War of the Rohirrim. Starting off with the one thing that sets the film apart. Yup, it'll be an anime film. Now up until this point, we've gotten a solid half-dozen feature films, but they were all live action. It's been nearly a decade since the Battle of the Five Armies was released, and it was clear that fans were looking for something kinda different. Animating J.R.R. Tolkien's visionary saga is a great way to break the mold. But if the film doesn't live up to expectations, the whole anime vibe will basically just be a gimmick. So what's this film gonna be about? Well, it's set a couple hundred years before the stories we've already seen. That's not counting the Silmarillion, obviously. But I'm talking about Tolkien's books that have already been adapted. As far as they're concerned, the furthest we've gone back in time is with The Hobbit. That trilogy takes place in the year 2941 of the Third Age. But War of the Rohirrim is gonna turn back the dial even further to around the year 2741. It's set in the land of Rohan, which fans might know as King Theoden's domain from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and it'll focus on a civil war that erupts between rival clans. Now, some of you might be wondering if this'll make it like House of the Dragon, which is also set a couple hundred years before the events of its iconic predecessor, Game of Thrones. But here's the thing, War of the Rohirrim is doing something different. For one thing, we're not going to be seeing any origin stories playing out. The Kingdom of Rohan is already established and thriving by this point in Middle-earth's history. But in order to understand the setting, we're gonna have to take a deep dive into some Tolkien lore. You see, Rohan first started taking shape in the year 2510 of the Third Age, when a group of men hailing from the northern lands of Rhovanion helped Gondor out when it was in a tight spot. Now, these Northmen were known for being neutral. They were kind of like the Switzerland of Middle-earth during the Third Age, because they didn't side with Morgoth and his minions, nor did they take up arms against him like the Elves of Rivendell and the Men of Gondor. Fast forward to the year 2510, and the Northmen are finally forced to pick a side. Gondor was facing constant threats from raiders called Easterlings, aka the men that tried to conquer all of Middle-earth with Morgoth and his evil armies. The king of the Northmen at the time was a man named Eorl the Young, and he was the first ruler of the Northmen to break the neutrality pact. You see, King Eorl knew that if Gondor fell, his own lands wouldn't be safe for long. So he decided to come to Gondor's aid. This sparked centuries of mutual respect between the two peoples, and Gondor was so grateful for the Northmen's help that they rewarded them with new lands. The people of Gondor called these lands Kalinardon, but when it was gifted to the Northmen of Rhovanion, it came to be known as the Kingdom of Rohan. Eorl the Young was the first ever king of this new nation, and he was succeeded by 7 more kings over the next couple of centuries. Eventually, the long peace of Rohan was broken, and it all came crashing down during the reign of a now legendary ruler, none other than the mythical Helm Hammerhand. You see, we've seen a statue of the great king in the Two Towers. In case you don't remember, he was the bearded, regal-looking dude holding a stone mallet in Helm's Deep. The mountain fortress gets its name from King Helm Hammerhand, and it turns out he's gonna be the protagonist of the upcoming animated film. Now, something tells me that the movie's gonna be full of compelling, complex characters. After all, the lands that became Rohan weren't exactly empty when Gondor gifted them to the Northmen. Rather, they were populated by another nation of men called the Dunlendings. Hailing from the region of Dunland, these so-called wild men had started to settle in Kalinardon. The Dunlendings were forced out of their new homes by the Northmen and Gondor, so they had to head back to Dunland. This created a simmering conflict that comes to a head during King Hammerhand's reign, because a would-be usurper named Wolf decides to join forces with the mortal enemies of his people, which leads to the conflict known as the War of Rohirrim. All of this comes from Tolkien's fictional histories of Middle-earth, and I expect the upcoming film to go into much greater detail, as well as change up a few things to make a more cohesive storyline. Now, while all of this sounds super exciting, some fans are worried that it might just be another cash grab. After all, the studio's really been milking Tolkien's lore. The Rings of Power took us thousands of years into the past, and it came on the heels of the Hobbit trilogy. There are a couple of red flags there for sure, like the Rings of Power changed a lot from Tolkien's lore, and it really depended on the nostalgia factor from Peter Jackson's trilogy to drum up any buzz. As for the Hobbit films, well, what can I say about an entire trilogy made out of a book that's barely half as long as Lord of the Rings? If I'm being honest, a lot of the Middle-earth myth-based projects we've seen ever since Jackson's iconic trilogy are undeniable cash grabs. Stretching out a simple adventure storyline in The Hobbit to make it seem more like The Lord of the Rings was disastrous. And while The Rings of Power was a great show for the most part, it changed too many things and hinted at Jackson's trilogy way too much to seem genuine. That said, I have a feeling that War of the Rohirrim is gonna switch things up a bit. I mean, it barely has any overlap with The Lord of the Rings. If the film sticks to the story closely enough, we're gonna get an epic saga that focuses on one specific area of Middle-earth, rather than a continent-spanning conflict involving Dark Lords and magical rings. None of the characters we know from Lord of the Rings are gonna appear, cause even if the studio's tempted to include them, it's gonna spark a riot among fans. Sure, a few characters are technically alive in this era, with Gandalf, Galadriel, and Elrond coming to mind, but they have nothing to do with the War of the Rohirrim, so the studio's probably gonna play it safe. Also, the fact that this is an anime is pretty telling. It separates the film even more from its live-action predecessors, which might be by design, cause there's a lot to suggest that the studio's looking to diversify as much as possible. Warner Brothers is trying to launch a new cinematic universe, with multiple new movies on the way. War of the Rohirrim is just the first of many to come, and given how it focuses on a unique period that has nothing to do with the struggle against Sauron, not to mention the serious lack of elves, wizards, and other easily marketable gimmicks, I'm hopeful that they're taking this seriously. There's a whole treasure trove of content that can be mined for decades, and if done right, Warner Brothers could create something that would even put the MCU to shame. Of course, that all depends on how well the movie performs. We're gonna have to wait until the 12th of April, 2024 to find out, cause that's the tentative release date for the film. So we know the general outline of the plot and how it fits in with the studio's big plans. But is there anything else to satisfy our curiosity? Unfortunately, there's very little detailed info on the movie so far. The movie is still in the early stages of production, so no one's been cast yet, although the casting is rumored to have begun. However, we know one thing for sure. Anime veteran Kenji Kamiyama is in the director's seat, which makes sense considering this is a proper anime film. It's gonna use the distinct Japanese animation style to its advantage, and they even have Sola Digital Arts to bring Kamiyama's vision to life. The Japanese director has already worked with the animation studio before, namely in Blade Runner Black Lotus, which was an anime they produced for Adult Swim based on the Blade Runner universe. Kamiyama clearly has experience with adapting live-action classics with stylized Japanese animation, so I'd say the movie is in good hands. As far as the director's concerned, that might seem like precious few details, but there's also some cool concept art that came out back in February. It showed those massive elephants that invaded Minas Tirith in Return of the King, except the city they're attacking happens to be Rohan's capital, Edoras. There's also a much grittier vibe to the art, cause rather than focusing on a single noble hero standing tall, it depicts a grim, destructive battle with zero sugarcoating. I, for one, loved the dark tone to the concept art, and I sincerely hope it reflects how the movie will turn out. So, from the steady hand of Kenji Kamiyama to guide the film, to the bold decision to create an anime adaptation of Tolkien's works, this was everything you need to know about Lord of the Rings: War of the Rohirrim.